Allow me to introduce you to my city. Situated here at the southern tip of Africa, Cape Town has a population of more than 4 million people, growing relatively rapidly as people from rural areas migrate into the city for job opportunities. It has a Mediterranean climate, wet and cool in the winter, that's from roughly May to September, and dry, hot and windy during the summer. The provision of water to the citizens of Cape Town is ultimately the responsibility of the South African National Department of Water and Sanitation, which takes care of the supply of bulk water into the city. The City of Cape Town municipality is responsible for the reticulation of that water throughout the city and for setting tariffs and charging households and businesses for the water that's delivered and the sewage that's removed. 98% of our water is supplied from 6 large dams far outside the city. Going into the drought, most Cape Townians had probably never actually seen any of the dams where we get our water from, and had certainly very little idea of the complex engineering systems that bring the water from the surrounding mountain catchment areas to their household taps. Yet during the drought, it started to become clear to many that those 6 dams provided the water not only for us city dwellers, but also for the surrounding small towns and the farmlands where much of our food is grown. National government presides over the allocation of the available water in the dams between these various parties, ensuring there is enough water for vital irrigation of crops, as well as for businesses and households in the small towns and the city. Even in years when there is enough rain, it's a complex technical challenge to balance these competing needs. At the same time as being a large city, Cape Town is a divided city. There is a high level of wealth inequality which shows up in suburbs and settlements divided often along racial lines, an inheritance from the apartheid past. While the city's large, formal townships have water supplied to their households, there are roughly 150,000 households located in 437 informal settlements, where residents have to queue for water from standpipes. For these residents, water scarcity was a regular feature of their daily lives long before the drought arrived. One of the consequences of this inequality is that the city administration has to sell water to businesses and to the wealthy suburbs like these, so that it can not only meet its costs, but also subsidize a free basic amount of water every month for the roughly 1.5 million Cape Townians who can't afford to pay for it. That basic allocation of free water is a constitutional right granted to all South African citizens, whatever their ability to pay. Let's turn to the drought itself. This graph shows the historic inflows of water into Cape Town's dam system from the late 1920s onwards. Notice the severe drought in 1970 to 72, but be aware that the city's population then was a quarter of what it is today. So the city's closest experience of 3 years in a row of dry winters was about 45 years old, and even then the low rainfall was not quite as extreme as it turned out to be in 2015 to 2018. This second graph shows you how full the city's dams were at each stage of each year from 2010 to 2018. Bear in mind that the city's entire ability to supply fresh water to its 4 million people depended on these dam levels being above that lower blue dotted line. That line represents the point where the dam levels are so low that it becomes difficult to extract water. The upper dotted line represents the point where the dams start to overflow. You'll notice that the dam levels move up as the winter rains come and drop down as summer begins and people use more water, while at the same time evaporation from the dams increases with the heat. You can imagine that the people of Cape Town were relatively relaxed about their water supply as we headed into the winter of 2015. But that winter the rain hardly fell, and the same happened the following 2 winters, with 2017 being particularly dry. So we went into summer at the end of 2017 with historically low dams and really just one tool left in our hands with which to avoid running out of water: to reduce our water consumption dramatically. During that summer, urgent messages appeared in public places, in businesses, and on all media. A sustained public communication campaign, led by the city administration and assisted by the private sector, became hard to avoid, including specific advice on how to manage one's personal consumption right down. And the city increased mandatory restrictions to the point where by late January 2018, citizens were required to limit their personal consumption to 50 litres per day, compared with a pre-drought average of over 200 litres. Of course, averages can deceive. While a suburban home with a garden and swimming pool would have used several hundred litres per person per day, informal shack dwellers were used to queuing at public standpipes to draw as little as 15 litres per person per day. The critical communication to citizens from mid-January was that unless we could together get our consumption down to below 500 million litres a day, and if the dry weather continued, we risked facing day zero, the day when water would be physically rationed at 200 stations like this, positioned across the city. At the same time, the city ramped up its technically sophisticated pressure management strategy, which enabled them not to have to switch off water, instead reducing pressure for periods of time. By the end of the drought, they were saving an extraordinary 70 million litres a day by this method alone. But perhaps the biggest story was the way citizens changed their habits and reduced their consumption of water. Many households and businesses installed rainwater harvesting tanks, some also drilling boreholes into the underground aquifers. The ancient tradition of collecting water from the springs that flow off Table Mountain was spontaneously revived, in some cases bringing with it a vibrant sense of community resilience. This slide shows the city's total water consumption from 2010 to April 2020. At the peak in early 2015, we were using 1,200 million litres a day. By mid-2018, when we just passed the feared day zero point and knew that we had enough water to get us through that year, it had dropped to nearly 500 million litres a day, more than a 50% reduction. No other large city in the world is thought to have achieved this without having to cut off supply, something that the city of Cape Town never did. But perhaps even more remarkable is what happened in the following 2 years. Many predicted that once the danger had passed, residents would relax their habits and consumption would rebound to previous levels. Not so. Even in the summer of 2019-2020, our peak consumption never reached 800 million litres a day. The Cape Town drought, which reached crisis proportions in the summer of 2017-18, is a dramatic illustration of how a changing climate can threaten the health and well-being of millions of residents in a modern, well-managed city. But it won't be the last time we see this type of crisis play out. That is why, in the Cape Town Drought Response Learning Initiative, we asked 39 key people who were involved in responding to the crisis to reflect, at length and on camera, on what happened and what was learned. The picture that emerged, and the many crucial lessons that can now be passed on, are relevant not just in a drought, but in any major crisis that cities around the world may encounter in the years to come.